As a result of these partnerships, TMEA, UNECA, and EARC have produced this COVID-19 report, which we are launching today. Obviously, we're all aware about the COVID-19 pandemic, which has affected the globe and particularly the EAC region. And today, we are going to be looking at what some of the impacts on trade in the region. We are grateful to have a number of panelists in our session today. We have our chief guest, who's Madam Betty Maina, Ministry of Trade and Industrialization of Kenya. We also have one of the panelists, Mr. Jonas Munyuragabo, the Director General of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation at the Ministry of Trade and Industry of Rwanda. We have Ambassador Jeremy Banigwaninsigo, who is the PS Ministry of Trade, Transport, Industry, Tourism, Government of Burundi. We also have Mr. Ken Apollo Bagahunda, who is the EAC Director General, Customs Trade, based in Arusha. We also have Dr. Mazuki, CEO, EABC. We have Ms. Emma Marie Bukingo, who is Executive Director for Twest from Rwanda. We also have Ms. Martin Boylan, who is the EU Trade Council delegation of the European Union to the Republic of Kenya. And finally, we have Dr. Yat Smith, Senior Policy Officer, Sustainable Economic Development, Department of Directorate General for International Cooperation, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, The Hague. These are the panelists who are going to be joining our three principles for the three organizations. I will introduce them quite quickly. We have our TradeMark East Africa Chief Executive Officer, Frank Matsat. We have the Executive Director of the AERC, Professor June, and we have Madam Keita, who's representing UNECA. So at this point, I'll give a few directions in terms of this discussion. We have provided panelists with an opportunity to be able to view the questions, which we'll be moderating on. The session kick off from 2:05, and we expect to end at 4:30. So we have a 2-hour session this afternoon. We will have a Q&A session, which will be moderated immediately after the end of the session, in case we have burning questions that are coming from particularly our media colleagues who are attending. We do have representation of folks who are coming in from all over East Africa as well as the globe to view this event. The event is also live on Twitter. So for those who are interested, you can follow us on Twitter, where we will be posting a number of questions and also some of the responses from our panelists. At this event, let me invite our CEO, Frank Matsat, to provide a quick intro into the session and also on TradeMark East Africa. Frank.
I think I particularly wanted to welcome everyone today. Good afternoon, and particularly Professor Ndungu and Mama Keita, the two other research partners that I think are going to speak after me. I think we're really excited about today's launch. So TMEA, UNECA and AERC really welcome you warmly to this virtual event. We're delighted to have everyone with us, everyone making the effort to join. It's always tough doing these events virtually, but I think the great thing is it also allows people to ask questions. So we've got a really great group of outstanding panelists from across the region, and which we're going to hear from later. Sorry, could you put yourself on mute, please? That'd be great. Thank you. All right, and also I think we're very privileged to have, great people from different governments from the region, also from the regional economic communities, from the private sector and civil society, and of course our donor colleagues. So welcome everyone, and particularly grateful for our donors joining today, particularly those who've worked with us over the years and really allowed our work to happen. So many thanks, and thanks also for, I guess, supporting TradeMark's initiative to respond to the pandemic, which is called Safe Trade, and that's helped particularly protect border officials, both at the borders and the ports, but also to help keep jobs going and mitigating the impact, and some interesting innovation around truck driver tracking apps that I'm sure we'll talk about later. So, really grateful to the team that worked on this. This is very much a trilateral or a tripartite approach. You've got to be careful of saying tripartite in trade circles, but it's a very much a trilateral approach with UNECA and obviously the UNECA or UNECA and AERC. And I think we really appreciate the great partnership, particularly the proactive engagement with the strategic partners that really I think have added to quite a body of knowledge on trade and the pandemic in the region. So, and I think it's really important when you get quite seismic impacts like COVID to really look at the experience on the ground, because some of it is not as intuitive as you would think. So I think we've all, I'm not going to say much about the report because I think the co-authors will present it later. But I think, it's got quite important implications for the way that we all respond and the way that we think about trade growth and recovery. So at the moment, TradeMark, we're operating altogether in 12 countries across Eastern Africa. That now includes the work in the Horn. We're also looking at expanding our work to Southern Africa. And obviously, as many of you know, our core mandate is obviously to try to reduce the very high cost of trade in some places, but equally, really help bigger processes like the African Continental Free Trade area to get off the ground. I think it's been a tough year, and it's interesting to mark about the year since the pandemic started with this report. And I think, it's going to be with us for some time to come. The rollout of vaccines will take time. So the things that we've learned and the responses that we've co-generated, I think will be important, at least for the next year or two. As I said earlier, the main way that we at TradeMarks try to respond is through a dedicated emergency program called Safe Trade. Some of it is been very short term in terms of responding with PPE, personal protective equipment for border officials, but some of it also longer term, looking at value chains and particularly thinking about how we can protect informal traders' livelihoods. So, so with that, perhaps I'll just finish with saying, you may ask, why the report, why did we produce this report and why now? Well, I think for me, it's a year on really since the advent of the whole pandemic, but the situation I think remains very dynamic, and obviously the data is changing all the time. So I think we'll hear more from the technical teams, but allow maybe a few words on this. I think it's important to create an evidence base, based in data collection to allow for really robust policy making and programmatic responses. I think this report provides a really good starting point for governments, private sector and other stakeholders to really think about how we respond in the medium and longer term. And it provides a good bird's eye view on how our region really fared in 2020. And I think this is going to be important for many years to come. And as I said, the pandemic's not going away. It's really important that we take up the lessons and we support our countries to fully recover. I mean, the mantra being to build back and recover better. So the lessons are going to be crucial for the future. And there are wider processes at play where the lessons will need to be rolled out, for example, with the African Continental Free Trade area. So I think maybe let me wrap it up. I'm just so delighted to have you all join us. Really looking forward to the panel discussion. So I'll be looking forward to moderating that a little later. And also hearing from our chief guest, Cabinet Secretary Betty Minor, who will be joining us a little later, I think. So many thanks, and I really just wanted to say thanks to my team that worked really hard on this, led by Anthony. I think this is a great report, and I really, really appreciate the partnership that has forged this good piece of work into being. So with that, I'm looking forward to your active discussion and participation later. And many thanks, and we'll look forward to launching the report officially as the afternoon goes by. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Frank, for that quick introduction. And I will move forward and invite our partner on this trilateral, as you mentioned. This is a joint engagement with three organizations: TradeMark East Africa, UNECA, and AERC. So let me invite the Executive Director of AERC, Professor Njuguna, to give some remarks before we invite UNECA as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm very delighted to be part of this work, the report that is being provided today. And I'm also very excited that we have been able to work together with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and as well as TradeMark East Africa. I'm very delighted for this kind of collaboration. The usual thing was I wanted to actually honor all the guests, but because some of them have not arrived, I think I will just actually say that all protocols observed. I'm very happy that there's most of the people that I know I've worked with. I'm so happy about that. But let me start by saying welcome to Nairobi for those, good afternoon from Nairobi for those who are joining from far. I am very excited to be part of this symbolic event that brings three institutions together in our region. And indeed, this event is a testimony to a collaborative spirit that is going to generate credible and reliable evidence to inform and shape policies in our region. This is an area for us in AERC that we have worked on for the last 34 years. But it's so important that we can start actually trying to see how we manage and we even provide solutions to problems that are already with us, and we can already see the kind of practical solutions that can be generated. Indeed, if it extended across other areas, such collaborative spirit for these three institutions could bring more virtuous benefits to our region, governments, and the people. The AERC itself is very critical in this. AERC facilitates the implementation of projects for capacity building in Africa. We came into this project because we wanted to provide some quick COVID-19 management response in East Africa by recognizing the need for a harmonized regional response to the pandemic, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation provided us with a grant to facilitate this trend and also support the East African economies in terms of a coordinated response to minimize the supply side disruptions, as well as economic impact of the negative economic impact of the COVID-19. The project has been supported by East African Partner States, trade associations, and the Secretariat through generating empirical evidence. And this flagship report is one example. And the intention is actually to inform policies, to formulate strategies, and even administrative options that can help us cope with the pandemic and the management of the pandemic. From AERC perspective, this report has been very impactful and is going to provide some impactful success even in the future. The first thing is that it quantified the pandemic's trade impact, and it identified policy priorities and responses. And these are important areas of interest for most organizations in the region. And I'm very happy that trade associations such as East African Business Council, KEPSA, think tanks, donors, and line ministries, including very importantly, East African Community Secretariat, were among the many who actually supported this effort. The AERC is collaborating with some of these institutions, first because they have common areas of interest which can be exploited for the mutual benefit of the region, and then secondly because they can facilitate an exchange of knowledge and tap into each other's strength and relative comparative advantage. We at the AERC, we have supported capacity building in the sub-Saharan African region for the last 34 years. So we know the game, but more importantly, the game will be much better once those interesting outcomes are exploited, they are facilitated, they are implemented, and then we can see the results. The joint publication that is going to be launched today is one of the fruits of this collaboration, and AERC encourages more open, productive engagement in the future as we try to implement and even draw examples from what is really happening. The synthesizing the main findings and lessons learned is essential, not only to managing the current pandemic, but also how countries develop strategies and coping mechanisms in the future. Already, I'm listening to so many reports coming through. Some of them are talking about post-COVID economic recovery, but we know that the pandemic has not been resolved. So the first lesson for us is, in terms of coping mechanism, is actually to understand that the export sector in our region is extremely vulnerable. And there are so many examples. For example, the Dutch flower auction closure and what has really forced Kenyan flower farmers to really endure a major loss. So essentially, we need to actually ask ourselves, what next do we need to do in the export sector? And arguably, one of the needs is actually to create value-adding components supported by reforms in the global value chain. We have been participating in the G20 and T20, and one of them has been the Continental Free Trade Area. But it is not going to succeed. We also don't have an idea of how we can reform the global value chain. Some of the East African community governments provided financial and regulatory support to vulnerable export sectors. For example, Kenya government's stimulus programs. And this is very, very important, but they are short term. And for us, it's very, very important that we use this report and we use this experience to make sure that we have strong capability and strong reforms that are going to be sustainable in the future. The report draws our attention to important policy making and policy making on one hand and policy follow through to its conclusive end on the other. The AERC, as a premier capacity building, sees itself at the center of driving evidence-based policy discourse in Africa, but it can only be useful if it's taken up, implemented, and then we can talk about results. We at AERC would like to emphasize that the role of institutions in pushing reforms to shape economic behavior is more fundamental than factor endowment. Last week I was trying to discuss the issues of reforms, and I actually argued that in Africa, we don't reform until there is a crisis. So let us take advantage of the current crisis to make sure that we reform our institutions. They're going to drive economic behavior, even though the fundamental issues of factor endowment still remain. The behavior or the institutional leadership is very, very critical. The report shows that the challenges in implementing the COVID-19 protocols affected cargo movement along major corridors and contributed to the initial decline in intra-East African exports. And there are several cases in point, and we could observe even border crossing points, how problematic they were. However, the collaboration between governments, private sector, donors, and the East African Secretariat has helped minimize some of these bottlenecks. I'm very happy that TradeMark East Africa, as has been alluded, supported the development of a regional electronic cargo and driver tracking system, which facilitated the issuance of COVID-19 digital certificates mutually recognized by partner states. And this contributed to reducing the delays in the border points. This is a good example of how we can use the technology around us to actually resolve the coordination problems that may emerge. And we are so happy that the GIZ donated mobile laboratories, test kits, personal protective equipment to the East African community. Again, all these initiatives echo the collaborative spirit among the players. Before I conclude, I would like to reiterate one fundamental point for all of us to ponder as we continue to fight the mutation of this and even the mutating environment of this pandemic. We need to combine policy responses with management and administrative actions in managing the crisis. I personally have been a policymaker, and I know that this can be done. Some of the various and in responses to the pandemic were inefficiencies in the management and administrative measures and the timeliness of those measures. And I don't want to give examples or lament about examples, but it's very, very important that we look at those in terms of how do we deal with them. In some instances, the implementation of these guidelines was hampered by administrative structures, especially those at the border points. And of course, we have seen impasse across the border points. But we do know that we could have avoided such mistakes, but at least we have learned our lessons. It is an important lesson in East African region, using our resolve to succeed, but also innovation to improve our institutions and their management capabilities. I still go on to emphasize the importance of institutions in shaping economic behavior, and I do consider this is a fundamental factor that this report that is going to be launched today is going to show us. It is not the resource endowments that is very, very important. It is the leadership and economic behavior that encourages prudent behavior in the marketplace, and that allows us to reap the benefits of the policies that we come up with, implement those policies, and see the results. In addition, it is important to learn lessons from the crisis so that we can reform, starting with institutions and then governments, and a coordinating role that prevents policy and market failure problems. So essentially, we owe it to the government so that it can coordinate and provide the facilitation that is required, and that is going to help us in terms of creating an environment that is conducive for all. I do believe that today is a very good day that we're shaping together, sharing this report, and also discussing with the policymakers in terms of what we would like to see in future. But more importantly, the success in terms of the first step of managing pandemics and the technology of managing pandemics in future is going to be very, very important for us. So thank you very much and good afternoon.
Thank you, Professor Njuguna. And if I might say that Professor Njuguna was the former governor of the central bank here in Kenya, and we're delighted to have you on this call as part of our partners. At this juncture, let me invite our third partner on this initiative, and this is Mama Keita, who is the director, UNECA Sub-Regional Office for Eastern Africa. UNECA has been a key partner for us working on this initiative and in past initiatives looking at COVID reports. Welcome, Mama Keita.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, all. Just 1 second. So let me provide my little welcome note. Excellency Cabinet Secretary, Madam Betty Maina, distinguished guests, dear Frank, dear Professor Njuguna, all protocol duly observed. Good afternoon to you all. I'm very pleased to be with you all at this virtual gathering, which aims to continue to explore the many impacts that this unexpected but long-lasting COVID crisis is having on our economies. My name is Mama Keita. I'm Director for UNECA's Sub-Regional Office for Eastern Africa. Before the crisis, Eastern Africa had been sustaining a very, very good growth performance, being the fastest growing sub-region in the continent for almost a decade. But before going further, I would like to also say that in ECA, what we call Eastern Africa is really a set of 14 countries, including, of course, EAC countries. But and then the region was the best performers within Africa, and the 14 countries were really collectively growing at a growth rate of 6%, which is double the growth rate for the entire continent. That being said, then COVID came, of course, and last year our COVID reports highlighted significant macroeconomic and social impact of the pandemic on the sub-region. GDP contracted for all countries, and of course more severely for countries heavily dependent on tourism and aviation-related sectors. Nevertheless, Eastern Africa remained the geographic sub-region with the highest level of growth, and so did the EAC among the regional economic communities. A worrying consequence of the crisis, though, is the increase in the debt burden, as it may have long-term effect on development prospects, reducing fiscal space and crowding out some much-needed productive investments. At ECA and at UN at large, in response to the COVID crisis, we have taken a coordinated approach from the start, bringing together all African countries to jointly assess the needs and appeal to the international community with one voice. We called for debt relief and liquidity facility initiatives in order to ease the tensions on national budgets We also organized together with the African Union Commission and other partners full procurement to facilitate cheap access to COVID-related medical and pharmaceutical products, including vaccines. Overall, the result of these efforts have been positive, leading to some initiatives such as the Debt Service Substantiation Initiative, the African Medical Supply Platform, the Summit of Head of State on COVID on Development Financing in September, etc. We will continue to support our member states with innovative ideas to find the resources necessary for economic recovery and for the achievement of the SDGs. As you know, we call this decade the decade of action to achieve the SDGs, and we would not like the COVID to prevent us from doing that. There is still a good basis for recovery. Forecasts for regional growth show that economies can bounce back. The report that we are going to launch today, produced in collaboration with TMEA and AERC, is yet an additional effort to continue to fill the knowledge gaps in terms of COVID impacts. And this will continue to be work in progress until the end of the crisis. The report has a specific focus on trade. Indeed, given the potential of trade to promote economic growth and sustainable development, it was extremely important for us to take a close look at the impact of COVID on trade in Eastern Africa. The reports, without revealing all the results before the official launch, sends out important messages, notably the urgent need to diversify countries' export base if they are to be more resilient to external shock and register strong and sustained growth rates. Our last year report on Afc Fta's impact for the region, which was also produced in collaboration with TMEA, indicated that the Afc Fta has great potential to contribute to this diversification. There are a lot of profitable opportunities for the private sector, as illustrated by the high rate of return in manufacturing and services sectors in Eastern Africa. The private sector needs to respond to those opportunities, particularly in future growth sectors like the digital economy and finance. As you know, the agreement came into force on 1st of January this year. We all need to work together to gradually make its impact felt by increasing intra-regional trade and investment and by deepening regional value chains for faster diversification and industrialization. What must Eastern Africa do to accelerate the path out of the crisis? We think that peace and security is, of course, a priority. Effort also must continue to rebuilding the fiscal sustainability for countries to continue to improve their trade, investment, and business environment and continue to grow. The regional agenda must move forward quickly. Countries must continue to ratify the Afc Fta and allow the big market to take shape in a meaningful way. 6 countries in Eastern Africa have already ratified the agreement. We urge others to join as soon as possible. Likewise, we would like to also urge the private sector to already start trading where possible. At ECA, we provide support to countries and regional economic commissions for formulation of Afc Fta implementation strategies. These strategies identify concrete action that need to be taken for countries to reap the full benefit of the agreement. We value our partnership with TMEA and AERC and hope that we can continue to work together for an effective implementation of those national and regional strategies. I would like to take this opportunity to say also a big thank you to the European Union, who has been with us from the onset in this endeavor, and also invite all other organizations that would like to join us in the same spirit. On this note, distinguished guests, panelists, thank you once again for taking your time. I hope that we will find the conclusion and recommendation of this report useful in your respective capacities to enable an even better decision-making process for all of us, which will benefit growth and prosperity in Eastern Africa. On this note, thank you very much for your kind attention, and I wish you all a pleasant session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Keita, for your remarks and for the continued partnership between UNECA and TradeMark. At this juncture, I will invite the 3 presenters who are going to give us a quick presentation on the COVID-19 flagship report and its findings. We have Andrew Mould from UNECA, as well as Anthony Mveange from TradeMark East Africa. So over to you, Andrew and Anthony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nelson. Good afternoon, distinguished guests, colleagues. We're going to go through a brief overview of the main findings of the report. I understand it's going to be uploaded from your end, but if necessary, I can do that from here. I can share screen from here as well. Nelson, is it okay? Because
yes, Andrew, you can do that. Please go ahead.
Okay, let me share screen here then. Okay, so first, I'm going to just give an overview of some of the global context, but I'd like to say a few words as well about the title of this report. I'm going to speak about what's been happening globally just prior to the crisis, and then some of the latest African continental level trade data. And then Anthony will be explaining more of the detail of the report itself. But I just wanted to make an opening observation about the title, actually, Waving or Drowning, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on East Africa trade. Waving and drowning is a kind of expression in English where if you're sitting at a beach and you see somebody swimming in the sea in the distance and they seem to be waving, you can confuse that. You could be asking yourself, are they waving or are they drowning? Are they in difficulty? And the title really reflects the uncertainty that exists about the final outcomes from this COVID-19 impact on regional economies, and particularly on the trade impact. And when Anthony and myself initially started discussing this issue, we felt it was important to provide a very exhaustive overview of the existing trade data. And as Frank mentioned in the opening, it's a dynamic situation, new data is becoming available, but we thought it was important that now we're in the second year now, this pandemic, that it was good to look back and see precisely what have been the trade impacts on the East Africa region. So let me move forward. Excuse me 1 second. I'll start just with some global context. Global trade, in actual fact, was decelerating prior to the crisis and never really recovered from the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. There had been an initial rebound, but subsequently the trend's been quite poor. And that actually reflects poor global economic growth and investment over the last decade or so. And in 2019, globally trade was registering a negative figure of -2.8%. Another characteristic, stylized characteristic, which I think is important to draw attention to, is we discuss a lot these days global value chains and how important these are for trading opportunities for developing countries. And this graphic from the World Bank Development Report shows that global value chains in terms of participation were actually increasing to very high levels, being responsible for a large percentage of global trade. But then subsequently, from around 2014-15, there was a decline in this. Now, the interesting question is to ask why this was happening prior to the COVID-19 crisis. And I think there's a number of reasons we could point to. Firstly, the decline in overall economic growth and investment that we've seen over this last decade, the non-recovery from the financial crisis. Secondly, global value chains have matured. The fragmentation and the slicing up of the value chain has become more limited as opportunities for fragmenting production becomes more reduced. And thirdly, I think the most important thing perhaps to stress would be the fact that we've had slowing pace of trade reforms, and indeed over the recent years we had a growing protectionism, including in high-income countries. So this has basically meant that there's been a lost velocity in global trade over the last decade or so. And yet there is one exception to this, and that is South-South trade between developing countries and emerging markets. We actually see that in the 2000s, there was a sharp increase in the share of global trade that was accountable by the trade of developing countries in the South-South trade. And quite a remarkable increase, actually, from a 23% share of global trade to 42%. Now, again, the question is, what drove this increase in the importance of South-South trade going into, this is an important question as we move into the African Continental Free Trade Area. Well, the first thing is to stress that one driver of this has been the success of Southeast Asia as a regional value chain rather than a global value chain in terms of producing a lot of the goods which are ultimately exported by China, but actually the product of regional production. So a lot of dynamic trade in that region. It's also a response of developing countries to the saturation of high-income country markets. The predominance of imports from China has not left a lot of space for other developing countries to penetrate Western markets, and hence there's been more interest put in the developing South. And a third and final reason to explain this would be simply the economic dynamism of the South has been stronger, the economic growth since 2008, 2009 generally, than it has been in the high income countries in the North. Now, moving to the crisis itself, that's the backdrop. What happened with the crisis? Well, the initial predictions were actually extremely pessimistic. There was fears of a severe collapse in the global trade at the beginning of this pandemic. The WTO initially forecast a decline in the volume of global merchandise trade between -13% and -32% in 2020. UNCTAD similarly in June had an initial forecast of around a 20% drop, and a more modest decline was forecast by IMF. And for our region in particular, you can appreciate here that some organisations were forecasting very sharp declines, particularly for the landlocked countries in Eastern Africa. So the Economist Intelligence Unit, for example, while it was given rather more modest declines in trade for Kenya and Tanzania, they were expecting very, very large declines in exports, both exports and imports for Uganda and Rwanda, for example. This reflecting, I imagine, the scenarios regarding lockdowns related to the pandemic and how that would interrupt regional trade. So now, with the benefit of hindsight, what was the situation actually for the year? We've only got complete data for a number of countries, and Anthony's going to go into some of the detail now. From UNCTAD stat, we now have the data, the quarterly data for the year for global trade, and we can appreciate here, firstly, the global trade performance. There was a very sharp decline in the second quarter of -16% in global trade, but a subsequent recovery in the third quarter and a very sharp recovery in global trade patterns. And it is noticeable that although it's been a very severe dip in global trade, it's slightly less severe than the one that took place in the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. And we now also have some statistics from the same source from UNCTAD, firstly about the trends for the African continent. And here we see that Africa has been worse impacted at a continental level than the global average, with a very sharp decline of more than 20% in the second quarter of the year for the continent, with a small recovery in the third quarter. Now, of course, Africa is not a country, it's a continent with very diverse economies, a very heterogeneous economic structure, and of course this reflects in part the commodity prices, and particularly for fuel, for the fuel exporters on the continent, which have been very badly hit. That is not the case, with the exception of South Sudan, for countries in our sub-region, which actually tend to be net commodity importers. So here we see the results for the wider Eastern Africa region. Mama Keita mentioned that our office covers the wider Eastern Africa region, and this is not just the EAC, it's for the 14 member states here. And you find that in the second quarter, the decline had been -9.3% for Eastern Africa, but then with a strong recovery back almost to positive growth in the third quarter for the wider Eastern Africa region. So that's a very substantial rebound in the performance. Now, for the next slide, Anthony will now take you for what, the rationale behind the report and into some of the details of the report's findings. Over to you, Anthony.
you very much, Andrew. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Okay. I hope everyone else can see. Okay, can you all see?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to switch gear a little bit, and I want to focus now on the report. Andrew has set the scene on what is happening globally, what is happening in Africa, and then also what motivated this report. Well, there are a couple of reasons, 3 reasons basically, that motivated this report. First is lack of evidence. One of the things that was evident shortly after the onset of the pandemic is that policymakers were struggling, and most of the decisions were based on anecdotal evidence. So Andy and Ryan said, no, we need to think of how we can help policymakers in the region. So the paucity of evidence to support some of the policy decision making was really a big driver. And then we also wanted to take a stock of what has happened in 2020. Almost 1 year down the line, are we making any progress? This is particularly more important now that the virus is mutating. Are there lessons that we can learn from the first almost 1 year towards the second year excuse me, I'm told to put the slides in presentation mode so they look much more clear. Okay, as the pandemic is unfolding. And then also to understand comprehensively what are the impact of pandemic on trade performance. Again, this would be very important to shed some light on potential recovery plans that countries are thinking, both at the country level and at the regional level, and provide a way forward that is cohesive in terms of implementation. Now, so what are the key report findings? I'm going to go into key messages that we bring out from the report. So that we can actually understand what are we learning from the report, and then I'll focus on the policy implications, and then a little bit of what next, and Andrew will come back and discuss also the last bit of what next. So first of all, what we are observing, at least from for the 3 quarters of last year, EAC trade has been recovering. Well, in the beginning, Q1, things were worse, were not good, as you can actually see in Burundi, Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya, but things are picking up along the line as the time went by. So what we would argue a V recovery, so to speak. Exports declined in the beginning because of the shock, supply side disruption at the global level, closure of borders, and so on and so forth. But on the second quarter, it started picking up. Which is good news. So at least what we know here is that exports in the region recovered, and the recent data that we have as early as January, they do seem to indicate that the region is actually becoming much more resilient. Okay, what are the key drivers of exports recovery in East Africa? One, if you look at Kenya, we look at Kenya as a barometer, because it's one of the largest trading partner in the region. There was an increase of manufactured exports, especially industrial supplies, non-food and capital equipment. And if you look for Tanzania and other landlocked countries, there was also an increase in export of manufactured products, and also gold. Gold exports surged significantly during this period, and we all know why, because of the price shock, positive price shocks that happened in the West, and that led to gold prices to increase, and in the process, gold exports become much more lucrative for our countries. So therefore, what we see here is that even if we remove gold in the analysis, and the report puts that out very clearly, even if we remove gold into the analysis, we still see exports of manufactured goods quite increasing dramatically for about 46%, if I remember correctly, in the region. So that's a good news. That's good news as one of the drivers that manufactured export did well. And I think in terms of policy, and we'll discuss more on the policy implications, it sheds some lights on what then needs to be done to help the region be more resilient and recover to its original track. What about intra-EAC, the trade among countries in the region? We can actually see from January 2020 to all the way April, the first quarter, so to speak, intra-EAC was basically red, declining significantly across countries. but then it started picking up in the second quarter from May, June, July. Also, it picked up. July was very high. There was a slight dip in August, and then September it picked up. So on average, what we are seeing here, intra-EAC has been rather resilient, and so is extra-EAC trade, only that intra-EAC seems to be much more stronger relative to extra-EAC exports. And this for only 3 countries we are looking at here. These are percentage changes, monthly percentage changes of how we fared in the last 3 quarters of last year. Okay. In terms of imports, so what we see here, imports declined, and the decline in import is very well understood. I believe there's so much evidence to that, partly because of border closure, countries closing their borders, supply chain disruption in China, especially for our countries where 30% of imports are coming from China and India. Closure of borders, borders in China and India affected dramatically the imports in the first 3 months of the pandemic. That was an advantage for our countries, because then the trade balance, trade deficit narrowed a little bit, and you can actually see the red line was a little bit increasing, which was good news. But then again, imports have started to peak, things have started bouncing back, and also, of course, the bad news to that is that it makes our trade balance persistently in deficit. Ideally, we don't want such a situation, but things are picking up, and that could be another discussion. I know policymakers are looking at it, but at least in the first 4 or 5 months, we could see some relief in the trade deficit, trade balance, across our countries. So there was some short-term relief, which was good. And then now let's come to trade facilitation aspects, and I want to talk more of performance of ports here. And we are looking at ports of Mombasa and the port of Dar es Salaam. The port of Mombasa, Q1, there was a decline. Again, closure of borders, supply chain disruption. So the lowest value of cargo for imports was May 2020 in the first quarter, and then for export was April 2020. Partly the lowest value, this decline in imports, or rather at the port of Mombasa, was precipitated by decline in imports and dry bulk exports that were coming in from the port of Mombasa. But we saw some subsequent, in the third quarter, we actually saw some significant recovery, that these imports and exports started to peak, and the port is now actually as active as it was probably sometimes the year before pandemic. When it comes to Dar es Salaam, we see pretty much the same trend. Imports were lower in June and April. Imports were lower in June, exports were lower in April. Partly because of the imports in Tanzania declined, and exports to Congo DRC also declined. But then again, in Q3, things started to pick up, and we see recovery. We see that the port of Dar es Salaam has started to be busy, and things are back to where they used to be. Now, just before I transition to informal cross-border trade, these are some of the good news that we see in terms of what we are learning from the data and the analysis we have done in the report on the impact of pandemic. So these are the positive externalities that we see with respect to COVID-19 and how countries have been resilient. However, there are also some bleak areas that we need to also pay attention to. And one of the area is informal cross-border trade. And what we actually look at least the analysis from the data from Uganda, informal cross-border trade has been adversely affected. And in fact, even now, after even opening borders, it has not been easy to recover to the original trends. And that says that the impact was very profound to cross-border trade. In fact, if you look at the data, the average in the first quarter, the average was about 44 million USD to 1.15 million in November 2020. That's a 97% reduction in cross-border trade because of COVID-19. So I think, and I allude to this during the policy implications, what that means for policy and what can governments do to ensure that informal cross-border trade, which accounts for majority women and youth across borders, can be revived to bring it back to normalcy. Another bleak area that needs a little bit of it raises concern is the increase in transit time along northern and central corridors. And here I would like to compare between Q1 of 2020 vis-a-vis Q3 of 2020. On the northern corridor, for example, transit time from Mombasa to Malaba increased from 7 to 10.5 days. From Mombasa to Busia, it increased almost twice as much, from 8.3 days to 16.6 days. This is significant, and this is very devastating for businesses. And I know TradeMark has been trying to intervene in these areas to support countries to ensure that at least this transit time and cost implicitly are lowered in some ways. On the central corridor, we see that Dar Kigali also increased from 4.6 to 10 days. It almost doubled. Dar Bujumbura from 5.3 to 7.3 days, and Dar Kampala 6 to 7.3. So overall, what we are seeing from the data during this period, that transit time along both northern and central corridor increased, and we know increases in transit time translate into higher cost for businesses, and also it has welfare implications in terms of the prices that consumers end up paying at the end of the day. So this again is an area that I will focus on during the policy implication. What can the governments do in East Africa to help address some of these challenges? The last message, the last area of concern that we pick in the report and in the data that we have across countries in the region is there a heightened dependence on commodity exports? We have seen countries pushing for industrialization, for boosting manufacturing in the region. But what we are seeing from the data, from the analysis that we've done, is it's kind of worried a little bit, because we see so much dependence on commodity exports, which may not be sustainable in the future for long-run planning in our countries. One example here, we see, for example, tea moderately declined, and coffee also declined during this period. But gold, of course, it did very well, which is good. Then the question is, what do we need to do here? What should countries do? What should policymakers do? What should trade experts, and what should donors and experts and institutions like TradeMark East Africa or AERC or UNECA do to help address some of these endemic challenges that our countries are facing? Now I'm going to transition. So this tells you in short what the report says. So we have 3 key policy messages and 3 key challenges that needs to be considered for the region to actually be more resilient, for how the countries are going to respond going forward, bearing in mind that COVID-19 is still here with us. We are not out of the woods yet. That's a message that the report is trying to make. And I think working together, we should be able to beat the pandemic. Now, in terms of the policy implications, now what do these findings mean for policymakers? And I think this is where policymakers will probably pay more attention. There are 5 key takeaways here. The bigger picture is there's urgency for policy action. What are these key areas? We understand there are pressing financial or fiscal issues across countries. There are issues to do with more borrowing, but we do feel that, at least from the report, there is a need for continued support of key export sectors, especially those sectors that have been resilient during COVID-19, especially sectors that have seemed to withstand the challenges of COVID-19. If need be, government should ring-fence these sectors and support them to make sure that trade in East Africa is not affected. One of the challenges that we have seen, and we all know, our countries are vulnerable to global value chains. We are very vulnerable. When China closed its borders, when China closed production, we were literally brought down to our knees in terms of our capacity to produce. What does that mean for policy? What does that mean for us as economies that are striving to be independent? And this brings us to the point of strengthening regional value chain, enhancing capacity of our countries to produce regionally, to enhance our productive capacity so that we do not necessarily become vulnerable to shocks like this. We are not saying that, the report does not say that regional value chain is the only way to go. Maybe a hybrid of the two, especially in sectors that we feel that are particularly important and make our economies much more vulnerable. Then the need for diversifying our economies. One of the slide I presented, I talked about dependence on commodities. Sorry. Now, for how long can we continue doing that? I think that brings us to the point of diversification. Do we need to diversify? The answer is yes. In what sectors? I think that warrants more looking into, but diversification is key so that our economies do not become vulnerable. And perhaps, again, similar to my previous point, perhaps CFTA, that has been a buzzword in town right now, could be a way to go. How can we harness the synergy of CFTA across our countries, across our region, relative to other regions in Africa, to be able to tap into these opportunities and reverse the trend that we're facing. Cross-border trade, as I mentioned, is really still a challenge, and that requires an urgent action from all players across our borders. We need to address these challenges for several reasons, but the most important one is because informal traders are mainly women. And if we don't address these challenges that informal traders are facing, at least from the analysis of this report, then there could be a potential impact on the reverse of fortunes, especially for women traders across borders, who rely heavily on cross-border trading for their livelihood, rely heavily for cross-border trade as their source of employment. So if cross-border trade is going to be crushed indefinitely or persistently for the next 6 months, we are going to see quite a lot of negative impacts across borders. And the last policy action that the report proposes is the need to invest and develop implementation of technological innovation. We have seen the TradeMark's intervention with the EAC Secretariat on Regional Electronic Cargo and Drivers Tracking System has helped to produce e-certificates for COVID-19 testing. Now, can we do more in that front? The answer is yes. And I think government, that's an area that is still more support, more efforts are needed to help countries. More technological innovation are needed to help countries abate some of the challenges that are COVID-19 induced. Technology has worked and it is working. Right now we are launching this report virtually that says technology is working. Can we extend this knowledge to trade, to areas that affect trade the most? The answer is yes, and I think that's doable. So these are the key policy implications, key messages that we would like policymakers from this region to actually take away as part of the message that this report is delivering. Now, what does that mean then? Is one would wonder probably, so what? Now we know the policy implication, probably you have heard about this before. So what? So as a way to give away, to conclude this presentation, Andrew and I agreed that we will pose questions. We want to leave you with questions to think about. I will present on the short-term questions and Andrew will come in and present on the long-term strategic questions for the region, okay? Now, what next now? So there are 3 key short-term questions to think about, and I'm putting this out there as a challenge for institutions like TradeMark, for AERC, for UNECA, for policymakers, for well-wishers, for donors. What can we do? What do these findings mean for EAC recovery plans? Right now, I know there are a lot of discussions, a lot of meetings, trying to ponder on what are the next steps in terms of recovery, what sectors should we focus on. So then I think this report brings out these very pragmatic issues that policymakers need to look into. What do these findings mean for EAC recovery? I'm not asking anyone to answer right now, but I think this is a takeaway question, at least on the short-term policy response towards this pandemic. And what should policymakers do, given that this pandemic is still a threat, and that it could reverse the gains that we have so far achieved? As I documented in the findings, we see a V-shaped recovery in some key sectors. Now, what can we do? Pandemic is still here to stay with us. Are there ways, are there things that we need to think about strategically and collaboratively as a region, as individual countries? Can we do something to ensure that, can we set policies that can actually help abate the impact of COVID-19 as we go along planning the economic recovery plans? And the last short-term question, short-term policy question to think about is, how can donors support the trade recovery? You know, they are struggling in their own economies, but they have still been here with us, supporting us in ways that we are very appreciative. But what can they do to support us? What can they do to help us? This region will need support from donors. We've seen donors who are supporting initiatives like TradeMark that are doing. We've seen other donors intervening in different places, in different capacities. Mama Keita explained about the role of EU in supporting some of the activities that UNECA is carrying out. Professor Njuguna explained about the role of, say, institutions like Bill and Melinda Gates that have been supporting this project on their side. So what can we do collectively? There needs to be more collective efforts towards addressing some of these challenges that the region is facing. This is critical. The time to think is now, the time to act is now, and we need to do it now. So before I stop, I would like to invite Andrew to discuss the last bit of this presentation, which will be on long-term strategic questions. Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. Yes, so broadly speaking, as we've been undertaking this research, we were pleasantly surprised by the resilience of regional economies. For 4 out of the 5 economies where we currently have up-to-date trade data, we see that exports actually expanded despite the intensity of the global impact of this crisis on global trade. But we felt it was important that perhaps in the discussions also we could have a discussion about the longer-term strategic issues that arise from this crisis, because it isn't going to impact on the way the global economy grows in the future. So the first of those questions would be, which markets should East African countries be targeting in the future? Should that be the high income, possibly slow growing markets, or should it be the faster growing, lower income markets going forward? There's a lot of uncertainty currently about how the global economy is going to come out of the crisis, whether there'll be a sharp, fast rebound or whether it will be a slow, gradual recovery. But this is an important issue in terms of export strategy, which markets to target. And the second point to raise is we know from research that contrary to popular opinion, trade doesn't tend to grow by exporting more products. It tends to grow, 60% of global trade growth is estimated to be through countries moving into new products rather than exporting more of what they already export. So that's a very important issue to take into account as well. How do we diversify the export basket of the Eastern Africa region? And that brings us to our final point, which is how can intra-regional and African trade under the Afc Fta help support this diversification? We know that intra-regional trade is far more diversified than extra-regional trade. And so what can we do to speed up the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area? So those would be the 3 longer-term strategic take-homes from this. Anthony and myself and Mark as well, who's accompanied us in the elaboration of this report, we'd like to thank you all for your attention, and we look forward very much to listening to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Anthony, for the presentation. It's our request, Andrew and Anthony, if you could just go, just give about 5 more minutes through your presentation in case there are any additional discussions so that we can try and add in the CS as well as the panelists. Andrew and Anthony, please go ahead.
Thank you, Nelson. And maybe because we were rushing through the presentation. Yes, we are rushing through the presentation. Perhaps, Andy, one of the area maybe that I wanted to talk more about to emphasize these policy implications, and I think that it's critical for governments to pay attention to this. And I think going forward, a coordinated approach is needed. Pandemic is still here with us, that's for sure. All support that is available, all hands should be on deck, they say. Coordinated approach is very, very critical for EAC collectively to get out of this pandemic. So far, the signs are very, very good, are very promising. But whether we can sustain such positive trends, whether we can sustain the recovery signals that we see right now, that remains to be seen. And what can governments do then? How can we work together? Private sector, how can we engage? As the TradeMark said, we are ready to engage. As AERC said, they're ready to engage. UNECA is ready to engage. What can we do as a region collectively? These findings are some, and maybe Andrew forgot to mention in the beginning, the analysis that we have in the report, it's only focusing on mechanized trade. We have not shifted on the service sector, because for some reasons, because of data availability and the ease of doing quick analysis to make sense of what is happening out there. But what if we switch to service sector? What does it mean for our economies? What can we do better? And I know there was a huge cry out when pandemic hit our region. The first area we see the impact is tourism and the hospitality industry. They were hugely affected. Can we do better? Yes. Can we work together collectively as a region? Yes. What about the CFTA? Can we do better in terms of coordinating ourselves and working together as a regional bloc to take advantage of the CFTA when we trade with other regional blocs in Africa? The answer is resoundingly yes. Is there a room for us to improve and have these targeted sectoral interventions? The answer is yes. So I think the report is a little bit of a wake-up call for us as individual countries to work individually, but most importantly to work collectively as a region, because whatever is happening in Tanzania is also affecting Kenya, is also affecting Uganda, it is also affecting Rwanda, but it's our collective responsibility to work together as a region to be able to get out of this crisis. So I wanted to say that and sort of to reinforce the message that we are trying to put across, and this report is trying to communicate. We are hoping maybe we should be able to do something like this towards in the next 6-7 months and take a stock and look at what have we done, how have we fared in the last 2 years, and what did we learn from policy perspective in terms of what worked, what did not work. What policy levers were able to address some of the challenges that maybe the report or other reports are proposing, and what policy levers did not work, and to what extent. So Andrew, I wanted to highlight those. I don't know whether you have something else to add.
Well, yes, thanks, Anthony. I think just a general comment, global trade growth over the last few decades has generally been through regional processes. We've seen the WTO and the multilateral system really not playing a great protagonism in terms of helping with global trade development. We now have a different environment over the last few weeks. We have a new, and since the last few days, we have a new boss of the WTO. We have a new American administration in, which is now less protectionist in principle and more supportive of multilateral organizations. So I think that's an interesting dimension to things now as well. The African continent clearly has put a lot of political importance into the Afc Fta. However, when I make presentations on this, I do stress it is a process, it's not an event. That on the 1st of January, when we started trading under the Afc Fta, it's going to take a period of 5 to 10 years for the reduction of tariffs to actually take place across the region. So it will take some time for its impact to be felt. But in the meantime, there's a lot of interesting developments going on with the global trading environment. So I think for policymakers, there's a lot of questions that need to be considered here. Do we go down the regional route or the global route? Do we target mostly principally the high income markets or the larger developing economies, or do we promote more trade with regional neighbours? So those are some of the main points I would take home from this report and from recent experience now.
I just wanted to raise this point, Andrew. Now that we have an African at the helm of WTO and the Biden leadership in the US, we are hoping to see positive trends in terms of how the World Trade Order is going to look like. And I hope that's good news. And for our region, it's good news for the World Trade Order in terms of balances that we expect to see going forward. We are hoping for the future that has less frictions among the big boys in the World Trade Club, so to speak. And we are hoping that that will have a ripple effect to our countries in terms of what are the next steps in terms of engaging both not only at the regional level, but multilaterally across countries in the region. I think what I wanted to emphasize, Andy, and you said this, is the role of CFTA into this bigger picture of what we see here. And I think one of the nudges of our report is to signal the relevance of that, especially for our region. And you and I, we have had this conversation on regional value chains. Where do we start and how can countries do? I understand at the EAC level, there has been discussions on how do we harmonize as a starting point for instituting these regional value chains. How do we start for harmonizing export processing zones, special economic zones? That's a good step going forward. How do we harmonize policies? And TradeMark is at the center supporting that. How do we generate evidence where UNECA and AERC can actually come in to inform policies? Regional value chain is still a very relevant area to consider for our region. We still need to build our own productive capacities as the region to enhance our ability to produce and sell outside, and not only our countries, but outside the region, and to tap into the 1.3 billion people market that we have in Africa through the CFTA. I think from the research side, it leaves a lot of interesting areas to look into. What are the impact of, for example, 6 months look back on the impact of CFTA in our region. To what extent EAC as a bloc has benefited. I know implementations will take longer because of the ongoing negotiations, but I think that brings to the fore questions that we need to think ahead of the curve as this COVID-19 is mutating. But again, looking at CFTA as a positive force, against the COVID-19, which is a negative force. So we have policymakers on the panel. We do have stakeholders who are particularly interested. And I think the launch of this report should start that conversation. We should have those dialogues back and forth. We should engage with key relevant people, our donors, our stakeholders, to make sure that all these great ideas are realized and they're taking our countries forward.
I would like to just request Mr. Jonas Munyoranga, I'm sorry, I find your last name difficult, but Munyoranga Bo, who's the Director General Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation at the Ministry of Trade and Industry in Rwanda. Are you connected, sir?
Yes, I'm connected. How are you?
DG Jonas, are you connected? Yep, okay, I can see you there. Fantastic. And also Ambassador Jeremy Banigwaning Zigo, are you there? Ambassador Jeremy is the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Trade, Transport and Industry and Tourism in the government of Burundi. Fantastic. Yes, okay. All right. Okay, good afternoon, and sorry about the technical glitch getting you on board, and apologies for my terrible pronunciation of your names. You'll have to forgive me there. I would ask all other panelists if you would just to turn your cameras off. So Kenneth, DG Kenneth, good to have you there. Just turn off your camera for a minute, and Yap, would you do that? And also Professor, would you turn yours off? Thank you. Okay. Good. Okay. Well, look, welcome everyone. I mean, I think, the two presenters did a great job of the kind of trilateral report here. And I think one of the key findings is that obviously aggregate exports from the region declined in April 2020, but then picked up quite quickly in the ensuing months. And by the third quarter, most of the EAC partner states actually even surpassed their 2019 export levels. So I think that's interesting. And, we're going to dig down into this in the panel. So I think DG Jonas, I'm going to kick it off with your good self if I could. Could you tell us, what your experiences have been in Rwanda with the state of exports? Secondly, I think what has the government learnt so far to prevent further export declines? And then my last question is, how do you feel, what policy should you put in place to make sure that the recovery in terms of exports is quite resilient? So if I could pass it over to you, DG Jonas. Apologies again for my pronunciation, but if you could just talk to those issues for 5 minutes, and then I'll pass it over to Ambassador Jeremy. Okay, you have the floor.
Good, thank you so much, I really appreciate this session. We have been trying to follow up the discussion, but it's good now that we are able to speak. The question on whether with our country experience aligns with the overall aggregate export growth that we have seen as per the findings of the report, I would say that I would confirm that we have seen the same trend after April 2020. The subsequent months we have seen export picking up, and as a result, by end of 2020, we have seen our export annual growth actually increased by 13.6%. Of course, this was due mainly to increase the export of non-traditional export and as well as minerals and re-export. These are really kind of representing an emerging diversification of our export, since we are heavily relying on traditional export in the past, but also in the tourism sectors. Although we have seen this export picking up, especially from the non-traditional export, things to do with milling industry, milling exports, maize, wheat, flour, vegetables, as well as flowers I've just mentioned. But we have seen a different story when it comes to non-traditional export. Here, talking about tea, coffee, and services as well as tourism. But at the end of the day, the aggregate export value has increased by 13.6%, which is in line with the report findings if you compare to the pre-COVID period, that is 2019. Now, on lessons that we have learned as the government, of course, we are still amidst the COVID pandemic, and you have heard of the recent lockdown in February and early even January. Of course, we are seeing some of the effects of the lockdowns. Of course, here is trying to look at the measures to, again, contain the pandemic, but still doing business as we export, also trade internally. So what we have learned through this period, I think it's almost a year, is that since we have seen intra-EAC or intra-regional trade not affected that much, as we have seen it for products that heavily depend on faraway market overseas, we think that promoting export to regional market is very key, especially non-traditional export. Here I'm alluding again to those products that we have seen that have really supported our growth overall in terms of export. That's number one. Number two, I think the report presenters also alluded to things to do with multi-sector coordination, stakeholder coordination, being private-public dialogue. In a crisis like this, you really need to get everyone on board and also hear from everyone and collaborate. Things to do with making sure that the logistics chain and supply chain is really streamlined in a way that it doesn't really affect much. Of course, the effect will still be there, but strong coordination through the supply chain and also the logistics part of it is very key, and we think this will help a lot to contain further effect on our export. Number three, as a lesson, is that we have learned that it's very important that we adopt what I will call digitalization of most of all of our services, especially customs procedures. As you have seen, we have recently worked on kind of shortening the time it takes, but also the costs in terms of what it takes to export or even to import. We have digitalized a number of procedures recently through our trade portal with the support again with TradeMark East Africa, and this really helps to avail some of the services online so that whoever wants to keep doing this business of exports is not constrained by the fact that there is a lockdown or any other constraining measures. I think this is really going to help as we go forward. Now, with the
DG, can I just ask you to wrap up if I could? Sorry, just because of time.
Yes, I was actually going to talk about the last question, which is now, what are the measures that we think are really very important? One is digitalization, I've just said. There have been also recovery fund that the government has put in place to support businesses, including exporters, but also looking at other ways of transport, including air cargo, which is one of the options that Rwanda has been looking at, but also promoting domestic tourism to at least support the tourism industry, which has been hit heavily, and we think this could add value to the industry as we go forward. I think I would stop from there as of now. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks so much, DG, and so really interesting points you've made there. Really appreciate. Well, maybe if we could just move on to Ambassador Jeremy. Ambassador, really the same questions. I mean, how do you think that the pandemic affected Burundi's exports? And, you know, what have you done so far and what have you learned that's helped to stem the problem initially? And then finally, what are you doing to help in terms of building the resilience of your exports in Burundi? Can I pass it over to you just for 5 minutes, sir? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for those questions. And good afternoon, everybody. And about experience with the state of exports, the pandemic is affecting Burundi in two ways, and involving national outbreak and economic impact of global regional conditions. And the economic growth projections for 2020 have been revised downwards by 5.3%, and a contraction of 3.2% is now expected. And the exacerbates pre-existing economic problems and create considerable external financing needs in 2020 and 2021, mainly due to a drop in exports, high imports needs, and a drop in remittances from expatriate workers. And about also exports, indeed, the main Burundi trading partners have been the most affected by the pandemic also. And also for a general decrease in nominal monthly percentages, changes in currency varies of imports and exports, and the customs revenue in April and May 2020 has been experienced. And about what the government done and learned in this situation, we can say that the government has quarantined travelers from countries affected by the pandemic, and it has stopped issuing entry visas and closed borders except to trade in goods and the humanitarian and the medical travel and the transport. And also Burundi government has encouraged citizens to produce more. E-commerce has been encouraged for exporters. Burundi government also has put in place a national task force committee, which is in charge of monitoring communication system during pandemics. And for the policy and the regulatory strategies, with plans also what our government was done is that the information for information, Burundi did not follow what other countries were doing, like closing schools, shutting down businesses, or closing ground air borders. Also, however, for the area of public health, the government has adopted in March a national emergency plan in order to face the pandemic crisis. In the export sectors, Burundi continued to export coffee, tea, and other products where it was possible, especially in the EAC. And also, no specific measures at the national river have been adopted. We only abide with directives and guidelines adopted by the community in regards to facilitation of movements of goods and the persons during the pandemic. And also no specific economic policy measures concerning taxes, subsidies, companies, sectors exposed or social protection has not been adopted to date. For economic recovery plan, the government from Burundi is encouraging farmers to produce more and increase local production, especially for the products imported from outside of the country. And finally, for specific sectors, interventions, it can be found in the EAC recovery plan. Thank you very much.
Thanks, PS. Really appreciate, and good to see good to hear about some of the policies that the government of Burundi has put in place and planning to. So many thanks. Well, I'd like to call on our next panelist now, and thank you to DG Jonas and Ambassador Jeremy there for, I think, some good insights. I'd like to now turn to Director General Kenneth Bagamunda, who's the DG of Trade over at the East African Community. Kenneth, I hope you're on the line. Yep, good, great, good to see you there, and good afternoon. So Kenneth, I mean, I hope you managed to have a good look at the report, but it indicates that given the kind of the fragility of supply chains and the global trading system during the pandemic, it's interesting that the trade outside of the EAC was more heavily impacted than trade within the EAC, and I think that's very interesting that intra-EAC exhibited generally a greater level of resilience than extra or outside EAC trade. And I just wanted you to comment, what in your opinion would you actually attribute that greater resilience of intra-regional trade to? What do you think are the factors that led to, better levels of, better performance on intra-regional trade? And then, yeah, well, perhaps you could cover that one first, Kenneth. Over to you, sir.
panel, I think I first want to thank the presenters for the insights they have given us today regarding the trend during the pandemic. Can you hear me, Frank?
Yes, Kenneth, we can hear you very well. Please proceed.
Yeah, okay. So I think there are some things we need to put into context when we are looking at extra EAC trade performance and intra-EAC trade performance. First of all, we need to understand the market destinations of the EAC exports, both particularly outside the EAC, and how those markets were affected by the pandemic. We need also to look at the product mix of our exports outside EAC and also traded within EAC, and how the trend has been behaving in terms of the product mix, and also generally look at the trade patterns that we have experienced in the recent past, maybe backwards from around 2016, 2017, and particularly on the intra-trade in relation to the products that are being traded and also the flows. First and foremost, Frank, the intra-trade in East Africa is relatively more diversified than the extra EAC trade. When you look at the number of products that are exported outside EAC, they remain limited as highlighted in the report. Basically, the commodities, the primary commodities and mineral exports. While the intra-EAC trade basket is expanding in the recent past, you find that manufactured goods are more traded now, but also the processed food products are also getting an increase in terms of trade flows within East Africa. And therefore, with the pandemic coming into in the EAC, it affected more the extra EAC trade exports because of the limitations, the non-diversification of the products that are exported outside EAC vis-a-vis those which are traded inside within EAC. Secondly, the extra trade is still dominated, as I have indicated, by the traditional agricultural commodities and minerals. And just before the pandemic started, there was already the international commodity prices were already declining, and therefore the coming into the pandemic exacerbated the additional export commodities, which are the main products that are exported outside East Africa. Products. And also now the increasing trade flows between countries, because when we were starting the community, you know, there was more or less a one-sided flow of goods of manufactured products from one country to the other partner states. But that thing is changing. That kind of pattern has changed. Well, we are starting to see a lot of movement, flows of goods between even the partner states, from the partner states that were traditionally net importers of manufactured goods from within the region. And I think that trend also has given the boost, the reinforced the resilience in terms of trade within the region.
Okay, Kenneth.
Yes, please.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to move on to the next question because I think you've given us a really good background there. So, I mean, what do you think in terms of policy and regulatory prescriptions should the EAC consider in terms of increasing the resilience of exports outside of the East African community? Ken, if I could ask you to answer that in 5 minutes, yeah, is that okay?
First of all, Frank, I want to inform the participants that at the EAC we have really been looking at all these options, policy options regarding how do we have economic recovery. And we already have a draft economic recovery plan and strategy that is forward-looking, that looks at what specific interventions are required. Of course, the pandemic has been an eye-opener in the regard to the critical importance of regional integration, because collective effort has proven that it can lead us to a more stable situation than if we remain in our isolated individual states. First of all, I think we need to recalibrate some of our policies and reorient them, repurpose them for purposes of addressing such kind of pandemics. The regional value chain policy framework is very critical and important, particularly focusing on export promotion. We need to diversify both the markets and the product. We need, and the CFTA, I think, comes in handy now, that it is on our doorstep to take advantage of that, and our policy, our diversification policies should really focus and target these new markets that are coming up. The e-commerce and digitalization of our is very critical, and I think the pandemic has shown that that's the way to go. We need now, it is important that we move quickly that support export production, that support intra-trade, and also support people to take advantage of the CFTA. We need also regional policies on financial incentives to boost, particularly the SME, support the SME. You have heard that the informal sector was the most during the pandemic. I think the EAC has focused mechanisms for the SMEs, particularly access to finance and better business environment. Of course, we need to go back on the drawing board and relook at some of the policies that we have and customize them to take care of such kind of challenges. Because this was an eye-opener, we had not fully envisaged that we would be affected by such kind of pandemic. So the trade, industrialization, agriculture modernization, value chain development, all those things need to be repackaged for purposes of building on the resilience that we have experienced and also overcoming the challenges that we are facing right now with the pandemic. Thank you, Frank.
Thanks so much, DG, and some really good points you've made there. I think, I'll circle back to you a wee bit later, but I'd like to now, and thank you very much, Ken, really appreciate. Let me pass it over now to the private sector, and I'd like to call on Dr. Peter Mathuki, Honourable, who's the CEO of the East African Business Council. Good afternoon, Peter, and thanks for bearing with us in terms of the technical issue.
Good afternoon, and happy.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, really good to have you on the line today. I just wanted to ask, looking back since the beginning of the pandemic, and I know you and I have spoken about this in the past, back in April, the EAC Secretariat under Ken's leadership really issued a set of admin guidelines or administrative guidelines to facilitate the movement of trade across the region. This was a step forward and, was meant to really reduce the problems of moving goods across borders. But as you heard in the report, one of the negative outcomes of the pandemic has been quite an increase in the transit times for the private sector. And I really wondered, what is the private sector view on this particular problem now that the costs of trade have gone up because of a lot of the COVID restrictions? What's your view on what should be done to reverse that and to, improve the efficiency of the transit trade network? Peter, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Frank, and it's my pleasure to see all of you this afternoon. It's an important session. But let me start by saying that this pandemic, no one was expecting it, and therefore becoming both health and economic crisis. But there are a few things I wanted to point out before I even answer that. And this again gives a reflection of the impact of COVID on intra-EAC trade. I'm happy that the report that was read came out also clearly. But in terms of losses, the trade between Kenya and Tanzania, we lost about $70 million. That is between March and August 2020. And $45 million, that is a decline in terms of exports from Uganda to Kenya. And in average, the average time of getting COVID tests again was 48 hours. Sometimes it could be longer, sometimes shorter, but in average 48 hours. But I would say some of the issues that we were facing, and we were on it, and we thank to TradeMark for the kind of support they gave to us and all other partners. There were serious delays in getting COVID tests, and these are some of the things, bringing a lot of backlog along the border points. And again, number two was again non-implementation of the EAC agreed COVID standard operating procedures, and that is something that I'm sure Ken may have spoken to. And again, the manual cargo scanning at Busia, again, that becoming a big challenge. And fourthly, there was instances of that some trucks, driving due to COVID as increasing operation costs because of this kind of delays. These are some of the things that we were able to experience. And again, inadequate testing reagents. And that became, of course, a very big issue. But one thing I must appreciate is that there was a resilience of transporters, particularly in the private sector and logistics sector, to ensure that operations were done amid COVID, and it was very difficult. At some point, I remember there were issues of truck drivers, facing all manner of challenges, but they were able to survive. Secondly, there was the stimulus packages that again government was able to bring in, and these are some of the things we must appreciate. Much as of course challenges were there, but most of the partner states were able to come in and and bring in the support. And again, the continuous advocacy and collective advocacy by ourselves with support from our partners that came out very clearly. And we kept on saying it's important that we have a very coordinated approach on dealing with COVID, both in terms of this and again removing the non-tariff barriers that were existing. And provision of PPEs, we kept on saying we need those provided the truck drivers. I wish that was done. And therefore removal of relay truck drivers. Again, there are those aspects of using relay driving, and we kept on saying please remove some of those things. So in terms of leveraging, we found that the adoption of digital services that was very useful, and therefore online banking issues and mobile money transfers and stuff like that were very useful in trying to support businesses. So I would say that indeed the harmonization would have been very key. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Sorry to. I think you made some really good points on a wide variety of issues there. I mean, the fact is, though, that for you as the private sector, the costs are now higher. What do you actually think needs to be done to bring the cost down again? And I'm going to just ask you another question. I mean, it's fine. Oftentimes, big business can withstand shocks, but informal trade is pretty much ground to a halt at the borders, and that's a big concern. I would imagine to many of your micro and small enterprise members of the East African Business Council. Is there anything that should be done particularly to help those smaller traders? Over to you. Yeah,
thank you very much. In fact, at some point, and when I saw the topic of the day on whether at some point I thought we were thinking as EAC, because we kept on talking about a coordinated approach in trying to respond to COVID. And in coordination, I meant that there should have been harmonization in terms of how we handle the issues among the partner states. But remember that all the partner states almost went each doing their own things, implementing their own things, and that threatened, at some point, felt it threatened our own community. Thanks to, at some point, the heads of state meeting, they met and came out clearly giving some directions, and that was the issue in terms of implementation. But again, some of the things that I felt we need to do is, going forward, is the issues of mutual recognition of certificates. And I feel that is something that ought to be done. And then harmonization of the COVID testing charges. And we kept on saying that different countries were charging different amount when it comes to testing. And therefore that was giving, a very difficult terrain for doing business, because in some cases it was very difficult to do businesses. So we felt it was important for them to harmonize some of these charges. And that would be possible if, again, there was a very coordinated approach. Rwanda, they were charging 60. Kenya sometimes, Burundi, URT were charging $100, and Kenya ranging between 50 to 100. And then we felt that encouraging testing for truck drivers at the point of origin, and that would have been important. I think it's important going forward. But also priority vaccination for truck drivers. When the vaccine comes here, I think it's important that government, as you prioritize the public servants, it's important as well you prioritize the truck drivers, because they do also very essential services. And then continue to issue cushioning facilities of our economies. It's important that we support businesses post-COVID. And then coordination when you come to quarantine systems for truck drivers, because I think these are some of the things that governments need to come together and agree. And I hope as we await the next Heads of State Summit, possibly by end of the month, some of these things will be critical. To us, vaccination aspect is important, and government need to come out clearly on how to address this. And I think truck drivers need to be given a priority. I thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And I think that all makes a lot of sense. And as you said, the next frontier is really around how the vaccines are prioritized. And let's hope that they reach us soon. I guess, maybe just to ask you to answer that question about the informal traders, because, a lot of the informal trade has really been badly affected at the borders. What in your view needs to be done to support that?
Thank you very much. Yes, informal traders, that was an issue across the border points. And indeed, we went and we realized that most of them are turned into using what we call escape routes, the informal routes for accessing business, because that happened. And that is something that we thought is important at becoming one of our advocacy issues for governments to even allow open borders very fast to support this, because that is something, an issue. When we look at the data and the information that we have, for example, Namanga, because of this COVID, the trucks reduced almost 40%, and Malaba by 30%, Busia by 40%, Rusumo went by 41%, Nemule by 25%, and Hispania by 64%, and Lunga by 70%, or really 71%. And therefore, most of the other business now was using the informal routes. And therefore, we kept on asking governments that we need possibly to open the border points in a very coordinated manner so that we can take care of this. So what we have done is that we have taken this as our priority priority advocacy issue. And in fact, in our memo to the chair of the council, we have picked the issue of SMEs and small-scale traders across the border to be an issue. But that would be possible if we have systems put in place at the border points, particularly now that we expect, of course, vaccine to come and so forth, and therefore to be happening. So that is a major issue. It still remains a big challenge, but we have picked it and we are sharing that with the council so that they can see how then this can be supported.
Okay, Peter. Well, really appreciate the view there from the private sector, and thanks so much, Peter. All right. Well, really, I think there's some interesting things that came out of that, and as you said, let me hand it over, if I could now, to our donor partners, and I'd like to first call Martin Bolen, who is the trade representative for the EU here in the delegation in the EU Trade Councillor, sorry, the delegation of the EU to Republic of Kenya. Good afternoon, Martin. Good to see you.
Hi, Frank.
And yeah, apologies for the technical glitches along the way, but it's great to have you on the line this afternoon. And I mean, you've heard some of the things that have come out of this report. A bit of a V-shaped recovery, differential, export performance, you know, hitting the informal sector hard. And I just kind of wondered from the EU's perspective as a key donor looking at trade on the continent, and one we greatly appreciate the support of, what would be your view on how you think some of the kind of threats and the reversal of gains achieved on corridor performance should be addressed? Over to you, Martin, you have the floor.
No, thank you very much. First, my compliments to TMEA, UNECA, and all the other partners that make this report possible. I think this is very useful. I can already tell you it has been distributed widely in Brussels and also to my colleagues in the other delegations here in the region. And everybody was very happy to see such a report already this fast while we're still in the pandemic. Just to get back to your question, I think I start with just fully agreeing what Peter just said. What we have seen, obviously, is that while the pandemic should basically be a public health issue, we saw it turning more into an economic issue here in the region. And actually, when I was reading the report, I was quite surprised to see that the internal exports and imports were still relatively stable, and that, of course, that the external exports were going down. That we knew because we've seen the numbers, particularly, well, me here being in Kenya, seen the numbers particularly going to the EU in the horticulture sector. But that being said, what I liked about what Peter said is, of course, that although it's an economic issue, the decisions are taken by the ministries of health. And what Peter also said is that what you should do is have a common approach. This is something that we in the EU have done from the beginning. And when it was decided to whatever would happen, as you might remember, in May, June, the internal borders were closed as well for the first time since the introduction of the common market, but they stayed open for truckers and trade. And I think that was an important discussion that was taking place in Brussels. And even though there has been a lot of good things coming from the EAC, we've seen, unfortunately, that on this area, indeed, I have to agree with Peter that some more could have been done, and we are very happy together with all the other member states. And Jaap is going to say something about it as well, I can imagine. But also Ireland and Finland, and we were happy to support TradeMark in at least having this safe trade emergency facility to alleviate the pressure a bit. The other thing is what I think is that means that it should be from now a political discussion. Where should we take it? I mean, nobody knows how long this pandemic will last. We have new strains of the virus every day. The vaccines is a big, well, you've seen the fight in the EU, but also we don't know when the vaccines arrive here. COVAX is something, and Gavi that we have, as the EU, have of course contributed to for quite a large amount, but still it will only be a first step in the vaccination of the continent. So what you should start investing in is two things. One is a political discussion on whether you would like to keep this stringent testing requirements for crossing the internal borders in the EAC. That, I mean, not only for truck drivers, but primarily also for the smaller, mostly women traders that are now kind of more or less out of a job, what we've seen in the report, and what we also could see at the different border posts we've all been visiting over the past 2 months. That is really disastrous for this group. So we would happily support such a discussion, but also the other thing is medical checks possibly are there to stay in a more stringent way that we were used to with the yellow fever and with Ebola. So it will be more. There has to be some kind of tracking, proper digital tracking, not only now of the testing, but also later of the vaccine in a proper way, proper identification. of the individuals crossing the borders. Only then you can be sure that things not only keep safe, but also that you can get rid of the time wasted currently at the borders, and that would make Peter Matuki and all his members very happy, I'm sure. So I really hope indeed with him and with all the others that next week in the summit, should that happen, that these topics are also on the agenda. So not only now, but let's look forward for the coming years and 2 years and 2 years and 3 years to have a proper, fast and efficient checks like being developed currently for airports, but also for land borders, Frank.
Thanks, Martin. A lot of good insights there. Really appreciate. And you know, role of digital plays a big role as well. Martin, what about this second question I asked, really, which is about the role of the EFTA? Any thoughts on that? You know, in the post-COVID recovery, and how do you? I mean, it was interesting what you were saying. How do you see that sort of playing out, really, in terms of the some of the measures that we've seen trying to fight the pandemic? Over to you.
Yeah, Frank, thanks. The EU, as you can imagine and also know, and most people will know as well, is a big supporter of the development of the Afc Fta. We're also extremely happy that it started off in the on the 1st of January, even though still a lot has to be done. But also in the EAC and the surrounding regional economic communities, because we believe that an Afc Fta needs strong regional economic communities. It's like our ambassador always says, it's a bit of a patchwork, a quilt of regional economic communities that is the foundation of the Afc Fta. And I'm very happy that most countries in the EAC have already ratified the agreement, that the tariff schedule has been submitted, and that I'm sure soon Kenneth and his colleagues are working hard on making it reality for the EAC as well in implementation agreements. This is the future. You need to have a horizon where you work towards. And at some point, even when we see the numbers and we've seen the resilience here in trade in East Africa, then I'm sure the same as you've been able in Africa to leave the 2008 crisis behind, in the 2-3 years from now, this will be just a nasty curve down and up in the economic recovery. And Afc Fta will help with that. Afc Fta will give this horizon and this future of a common market for the whole of Africa, and even after that, common market, maybe even a free trade continent to continent arrangement. But one thing, of course, representing the EU, being the biggest common market in the world, it took us 50 years. It took us even 60 years, and I like always add on also 2 world wars. I don't wish the wars to happen, but remind that it takes time, it takes trust, and it takes a lot of courage to do big things. And we will definitely continue to support together with our colleagues in other developmental agencies to make this all happen. And that will certainly help in turning the tide around for after this pandemic. And then we're talking about goods. Let's not about services yet, because tourism is something completely different, obviously. Yeah,
thanks, Martin. Really appreciate. Okay, and I think some really good points made there. And as Andrew Mould from UNECA says, you know, integration does take time, and I totally agree with that point too. We're also joined now by Emma Bugingo, who's the Executive Director of ProFem. Hi, Emma. Good afternoon. I hope you're on the line. Emma, are you there?
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Just pop your camera on if you would, Emma.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you really well. Yeah. But we'd like to probably see you if it's possible.
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, Emma, you know, we had Honourable Peter Mathuki on earlier from East African Business Council, and yes. I asked him the question, because you weren't on the line then, really about, you know, this report suggests that the impact on informal trade has been very, very severe. Many traders, particularly at borders, have lost their livelihoods, particularly women, and it's a big issue. And I just wondered if I could just give you 5 minutes, Emma, just to say, in your view, what should be done to help resuscitate trade for poor informal traders at the borders of East Africa. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon to everyone. Straight maybe to the point, I think there's quite a point that I want to raise on what should be done. One, by the governments, by different stakeholders and partners in the process. So one, I think it's very important for the governments, as they are putting up their strategic plans on the response to COVID-19, to make sure that this is grounded in a strong gender analysis, taking into account the gender roles, responsibilities, and dynamics. So this also includes ensuring that mitigation measures also address the burden of unpaid care work, and particularly those that affect women. The other thing is that I feel it's very important for the governments to have new and well-adapted financial and guarantee products, especially those that would help women who are in informal cross-border trade, and they can be able to work. And this should be embedded again in the ongoing national economic recovery plans, so that these women are financially supported and they are able to access whatever is there to support their businesses. Again, I think it's very also important for the government and the key stakeholders to strengthen innovative strategies so that these women can also be able to access digital devices so that they can be able to trade and of course access market information. Again, we know that most of these women don't have enough knowledge on how to use these digital devices. So it's very important for them to have those devices, again, to be trained on how to use those digital devices. Again, I think it's also important for women to have the right information on the prevention and mitigation measures on COVID on the right time, so that they can be able also to work toward those measures, since most of these women who are in informal cross-border trade are breadwinners of their family. So if they are affected by this COVID, then the whole family might be affected also. Maybe to the Secretariat, the East African Secretariat, I think Emma, also it's very important.
Emma, could I ask you to wrap it up just at a time?
Yes.
Okay, I'll give you a couple more minutes. Thanks.
Yeah, so for the EAC Secretariat, I think it's also important to make sure that our countries strengthen their mutual relationship so that these women can trade freely. Thank you.
Emma, lovely to hear your voice there, a very strong one. And I'm just sorry that we couldn't hear from you a bit earlier, but thanks so much. And I think a good set of suggestions there. Right, Jaap, I'm going to try to go to your good self. I think you're off mute now. And I think it'd be great to hear your views. Perhaps, you know, if you have any thoughts about the women traders, but equally, how do we really try to reverse the increase in trade costs in your view along the corridors? So Jaap, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. I'm honored to be at the panel with such a high level and high quality speakers. Thank you very much for the introduction to this report with real data produced in a very timely manner in difficult times like the corona. I think these issues which have been mentioned by many of the good speakers before me are worldwide. So I think there is a little bit to learn as well from how coordinated East Africa has been picking up the different issues between the different countries. For the future, because that's one of the questions which I see here on the screen, I think what we have learned is to recognize that the higher level of, let's say, the uncertainties in the world need another approach than the traditional one. So for the future, perhaps emergency buffer stocks might be an issue. Just like opening borders and reducing the costs. And I think TradeMark, with all the partners, is doing a great job reducing these costs through digital measures and incorporating the poorer parts of the populations, including women traders, youth, etc., etc. So from that perspective, I think that one of the most important things TradeMark has been doing is bring the different partners from the East African countries together and coordinate, work on coordination and recognizing each other's worries and translating them in proper and quick actions. I think the other angle is that where the Netherlands is and still is in favor of sustainable worldwide trade with as less barriers as possible. At the same time, we see the importance of having an equal access to medical equipment and be sure that the food security transports keep on going as well. So from that perspective, I hope that we'll be able to support TradeMark into the future. The Netherlands is a big supporter as well of the Aid for Trade. I think we belong to the top 5 supporters in terms of activities, and the UNCTAD and Geneva might assist as well in East African development, getting the borders open. I think the resilience is shown by the quick way trade has been picking up in East Africa. And there are many countries in the world who do not produce that type of data for inter-regional trade. And there is a lot to be learned for the next steps, where I think that to get trust among partners who are worried about their own population's health and safety is one of the big challenges now and in the future as well. And at the same time, I think not only from the trade perspective, but also from the health perspective and emergency measures, it might be useful to think of processes to quickly address future shocks. Whether it's natural disasters or health shocks like the COVID, that might be an issue to think of in the context of African Continental Free Trade Agreement, but especially you have to begin somewhere in East Africa. Considering the time, I'd like to leave it here. From the Netherlands, we're always interested in how to build back better and to see if there are opportunities and within the context of the important priorities to take into account the environmental impact or greening of trade and take into account youth employment and perhaps have another look at economic growth issues, for instance, in the service sector. But I want to leave it to this because the previous speakers have been mentioning all the most important things, and I think I just mentioned in a nutshell what's important from the Dutch perspective.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Jaap. Really appreciate. And you know, I also wanted to say just how grateful we are to the EU, the Netherlands, all of our donors, many of which I think are on the call, many of whom are on the call today. I wanted to particularly recognize Finland, Denmark, Canada, the US, the UK, Ireland, Belgium and Norway as well. So many thanks for the great support for the Safe Trade Programme. Well, Jaap, I think that, you know, that probably ends the panel discussion just now. I think we've heard perspectives from 2 governments in East Africa about some of the policy levers and things they've learned. We've heard some interesting points as well, I thought, from Director General Ken Bagamunda over at the East African community. We've heard the perspective of the private sector, small traders, and of course, also our development partners. And I think collectively there's quite a lot of interesting lessons that have come out of this, and we'll certainly be aiming to capture those. But once again, thanks to all our panelists. Let me give them a virtual round of applause myself. We really appreciate your time, and thanks ever so much to all of our participants for bearing with us with the technical problems, but I think that's been fully worthwhile. Unfortunately, because of the slippage, I've been informed that our chief guest will not be making her speech just now, and we'll obviously be aiming to put that into the record of the session at a later time. But maybe with that, thanks to all our panelists. Let me give them one more round of applause. Thank you very much. And over to our MC, Nelson. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you to all our speakers today and all our panelists, for braving the time. I know we've extended it by almost an hour due to the interruption, but thank you so much for bearing with us. I think this was quite an important report to share with you. I think it has quite some interesting findings, and also, for policymakers, what are we expecting in terms of how we can improve trade despite the challenges that we faced during this pandemic. At this point, we will proceed with the actual launch of the report, and I'll invite the three principals of the organizations, TradeMark CEO Frank Matsat, Mama Keita from UNECA, and Professor Njuguna. If you could probably just say a word or two as we launch the report. I'm going to beam it up, and at the same time, a link to all the three organizations where the report is housed. You can be able to download it. Is also going to be on the chat shortly. So I welcome Frank, Mama Keita, and Professor Ndungu to just say a few words as we launch the report. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks. I think, maybe if we go in that order, thanks so much again to our research partners. I just want to say massive well done to the team that really did the hard work. I know they put in a lot of hours and effort, and we really appreciate. I think the report, as you can see, has some quite interesting findings, a lot of policy ramifications, and I think it's something that we'll need to really sit back and really fully analyze, reflect on, to move it into action. So with that, I really just would say from all of us at TradeMark, thanks for this. I think we're officially launching the report. I do hope that all of those attending today will have a good look at it. And, I think in this kind of difficult time of pandemics affecting our trade, affecting the way that we do business or come together, I think we can really say that, this report will help in terms of the way that we respond. And I thought the panel discussion had some very good ideas too. So with that, just really to thank everyone once again. Thank you, and to our research partners, UNECA and AERC. Really appreciate the collaboration. And all I can say is, yeah, let's hope there's a lot more of this to come, and that, as usual, East Africa leads the way in terms of the research and some of the policy thinking. So with that, just say thank you. I think we officially launched this report together, and with that, I think I'll pass it over, if I could, to Mama Keita. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Frank. Thank you to all participants, to the team of also who coordinated this report. Really insightful report. The report also is meeting all its objectives. The objective was really to make to move from anecdotal thinking and intuition to fact to evidence-based policy making. I think the report is really responding to this need. We've learned new things, especially, for instance, that the cost of trading is increasing. The time of transaction time is also increasing. Cross-border trade, we have been able to put a figure on the magnitude to which they are being hit. And we have learned some interesting policy measures out of these, notably coordinated approach It has come out a lot, and I think this is giving us really insight on how to craft or to improve recovery plans, which are indeed living documents. One measure that is really striking to me is the need to make truck driver priority in terms of the vaccination schedule. I think this is really important. It's insightful. It is maybe also a new thinking. So we've learned a lot. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to all, again, the technical team who drafted this. And let's continue thinking together and endeavoring together to make things happen, to diversify our economies and to go towards industrialization, which is the only way to really be, strong and resilient and to move to the next level. Thank you very much. And indeed, the report is launched, and we invite everyone to share it widely and to read it, of course, to keep learning. And over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mama Keita. I'd invite now Professor Njuguna, if you could just make your closing remarks and your vote of thanks as we close the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited that we are here to launch this report. The African Economic Research Consortium has combined its capability in terms of research and capacity building with practicalities in terms of how this report has been developed, working with the trade associations, and also combining and coordinating with TradeMark East Africa and United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. I'm very happy about that because it combines a generation of knowledge, which is going to guide policy, not only because it is the pandemic time, but it's also because we need a blueprint of policies that will help us to strategize in terms of the post-COVID economic recovery. And we know that we can understand how our vulnerabilities in the trade sector has been affected, and we know we can reform. I argued in the very beginning that it is reforms that are very, very important. It is institutions that are going to lead the reforms that are going to be very, very important. And I hope this report will be read, but more importantly, the lessons that have been drawn from this can be implemented so that we strengthen our capability in terms of not only managing pandemics, but also trying to chart the way forward in terms of how we can reform trade. I've argued that if we want to take advantage of trade, then we have to be ready to reform. And we want to reform even the global value chain. And we also want to reform our cross-border trade mechanisms. And this is where we're going to gain the credit that is required, one, from managing the pandemics, and two, from forming a pillar for economic recovery in future. The report is now out, and we hope it will be read. And if need be, we can push. And I thank everyone who participated in this. I thank all the researchers, the trade associations, and I thank the coordination that we have shown between TradeMark East Africa, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and the African Economic Research Consortium. Let's continue this so that we provide the pillars for future development. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you, Professor Njuguna, and this marks the end of our event. Thank you so much to all our panelists, to all our partners, UNECA, AERC, and to the TradeMark session. We started at 2. We hoped to end at 4, but we're happy that you could be with us. As I mentioned earlier, the link to the report from all the websites from the different organizations is actually on the chat. So please look at the chat. You'll be able to download the report. And we look forward to receiving your input and your comments that you can send to either AERC or UNECA or TradeMark East Africa. Thank you very much and wishing you a nice rest of the day. Thank you.